What happens when two musical legends, one a trailblazing New York punk rock band and the other an avant-garde British producer, step into the studio together for the first time? You'd expect brilliance, right? Well, the reality of Television and Brian Eno's collaboration was something very different. A project that started with high hopes and ended in utter failure. In today's video, we'll be digging deep into the ill-fated studio sessions that took place now more than 50 years ago between Brian Eno and Television. Why did they go so terribly wrong? We'll explore the tensions and creative clashes that arose between these iconic musicians, provide a backstory on both Eno and Television's early careers, and break down exactly what happened in the studio that led to such an explosive fallout. I'm Andy Fenstermaker, host of Poetic Wax, a weekly music history series and now audio podcast where I dig into the record collection I've been building since the 1990s and explore the sometimes little-known history of a band, an album, or a song from within. I'm again pulling out this Television Live with Brian Eno, a bootleg that's become somewhat infamous for the wrong reasons. Before we dive into the heart of the demo sessions, let's now set the stage with some history. Television and Brian Eno may seem like unlikely collaborators at first glance, but in 1975, both artists were navigating pivotal points in their careers, though through very different angles. Television formed in New York City in 1972, co-founded by Tom Verlaine and Richard Hell. Coined by Hell, the name was devised as a pun, tell-a-vision, as well as a reference, of course, to reclaiming the dominant media of the era. They started as Neon Boys, but donned that name later on, and Verlaine kind of liked it. It wasn't until later that Hell realized that Tom Verlaine's initials were TV. They'd bring in Billy Ficca to play drums and Richard Lloyd as a second guitarist, who joined Verlaine and solidified the group's sound with quite distinctive guitar styles. Verlaine, often considered the brain behind the band, had an art rock sensibility that wasn't just about punk energy. It was also about precision. His background in poetry and his love for avant-garde jazz created a unique blend of intellectualism and raw power in his music. The band's sound featured intertwining guitar lines, something Verlaine developed with Lloyd, who was his equal in complexity, but had a grittier, more visceral approach. Add in Billy Ficca's jazzy drumming and Richard Hell's bass lines, and you had a sound that stood apart from the chaos of early punk. Already, though, by 1974, things between Verlaine and Hell were falling apart. Hell claims his song Blank Generation was recorded during the Eno sessions, though it never appeared on the bootlegs, and later recounts by literally everyone involved kind of discount that statement. A few months after the Eno sessions, Hell would leave the band, replaced by Fred Smith. In his 2013 post on The Blue Moment, Richard Williams would write, "No band can exist long with two leaders," which is how Television started, especially not when their ambitions are so divergent as Hell's and Verlaine's became. Television's rise coincided with the birth of New York's punk scene, centered around the iconic venue CBGB, the story of which I recounted in a previous episode where I talk about the introduction of punk to CBGB and the collapse of the Mercer Art Center, and how one kind of helped lead to the other. But they weren't a typical punk band. If the Ramones epitomized punk's stripped-down, rapid-paced, three-chord sound, Television was the opposite. They were cerebral, intricate, and more willing to experiment musically. There's almost no comparing the 2-minute, 14-second blitzkrieg bop by the Ramones to Television's 10-minute, 38-second Marquee Moon. Patti Smith, who briefly dated Verlaine, once noted that Television was a band that made the brain work hard, and it's easy to see why. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Brian Eno had carved out a place for himself as one of the most innovative figures in music, starting out with Roxy Music as their flamboyant synthesizer player. Eno left the band in '73, citing creative differences with Roxy's frontman, Brian Ferry. Eno wasn't content to just stand behind a keyboard, nor share the stage. He wanted to reinvent the rules of music and music production, and performance itself. After leaving Roxy Music, Eno went on to release a string of groundbreaking solo albums, starting with Here Come the Warm Jets in 1974. There was 1978's ambient masterpiece, Music for Films. But my favorite has always been Burning Airlines Give You So Much More, off of his 1974 album Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, which blends glam and art rock and all of that. Eno's approach was to treat the studio as an instrument, layering sounds, using unconventional techniques, and mapping recordings in ways few had done before, though it was starting to kind of pick up some steam in the 1970s. Eno's star was rising, but it wasn't just his solo work that was turning heads. He was becoming a sought-after producer for other artists and working with the likes of John Cale and, soon after the failed television sessions, David Bowie. He was building a reputation for pushing artists into uncharted territory, often with stunning results. But with television, his methods would lead to tension and eventually a complete breakdown. In October of 1974, Richard Williams, the head of A&R at Island Records in London, was introduced to television through friends, joining them as he attended a show on East 4th Street in New York, catching the newly formed Blondie, who, at the time, was underwhelming and far from their potential. As he notes, outside the looks of Debbie Harry herself, which always stunning. I was looking for something new, preferably something that wasn't wearing denim. And when I got home, I made arrangements to return as soon as possible and make demos with television. I contacted Eno, who readily agreed to help out at the sessions. His presence, I felt, might help influence my bosses at Island, and he might even get his management company, EG, interested in taking them on. The sessions took place at Good Vibrations, an unusual pick, but Island had used the studio for some salsa releases in the UK. I get a good rate and the use of an experienced engineer, John Fausti, and it was only going to be a demo session, so we didn't need Electric Lady or the record plant. From the outset, there were problems. The crux of the issue? Creative control and massive egos. On one side, you had Tom Verlaine, a notoriously strong-willed frontman. Verlaine was incredibly protective of the band's sound and vision. Sound and vision, that sounds familiar. By sound and vision, I do not mean the David Bowie song, which was released on Low in 1977 as part of the Berlin trilogy. No, his approach to music was almost puritanical. He believed in capturing the band as they were raw and unfiltered. Verlaine had spent the past few years honing television's intricate guitar arrangements, and he wasn't interested in having someone like Eno, who was known for his studio manipulation, dismantle or overprocess them. As Richard Lloyd later recalled, Tom had a very specific idea of how television should sound, and it didn't involve lots of studio tricks. Verlaine's style of leadership could border on autocratic, and for those of you like myself who are in the United States and don't really know what an autocrat is, an autocrat is a system of ruling whereby one person has or seeks absolute power, the opposite of a democracy. This would prove quite problematic when faced with Eno's avant-garde tendencies.
Of course, the other thing about rock music is that it has always been a social art. It's always something that people do together. It's not an individual enterprise like painting or sculpture. It's something that you do with other people. Now, I think for the last 15 or 20 years, that way of working has become much more sensible. The idea of groups has become much more reasonable idea than the idea of private individuals working. And of course, socially, it's quite an enlightened idea as well. It seems to me a very healthy direction to move in.
On the other side, Brian Eno. He came into the project with the same mindset that had produced some of his greatest work so far. Eno didn't see the studio as a place to merely record performances. He saw it as an instrument in and of itself. He was always trying to push the limits of sound, often using techniques like tape loops, synth overlays, and processing effects that manipulated the original recordings in real time. These were the kinds of tools that helped him shape his 1974 albums and that he'd continue to use to hone his groundbreaking ambient sounds. But in the context of television's music, they proved to be a catastrophic source of friction. The sessions quickly became a battleground. Verlaine clashed with Eno almost immediately, feeling that Eno was overproducing the music, while Eno, feeling that television's minimalist, straightforward approach was limiting what the recordings could achieve. Eno was reportedly fascinated by Verlaine's guitar sound. I mean, it was Tom Verlaine who wouldn't be in that situation. But he wanted to blend it with studio techniques that Verlaine refused to accept. Billy Vicka, the band's drummer, recalled the tension in an interview, saying, Eno wanted us to sound bigger, more expansive, but Tom didn't want to lose the edge we had. Even Richard Lloyd, who was usually more open to experimentation, felt the sessions weren't going anywhere. He would write the following in a YouTube comment in 2013. This was not produced by Brian Eno. Richard Williams from Island wanted to record the band and said that he would like to bring Eno along because Richard didn't know anything about how to record in studios. So we said okay, but didn't use a single idea that Eno brought. Ultimately, the sessions went nowhere. What started as a promising collaboration ended with both Eno and Television walking away dissatisfied. Eno was frustrated with the band's reluctance to experiment, while Verlaine and the rest of Television felt Eno's methods were distorting their music beyond recognition. Verlaine was a fastidious perfectionist and wanted things done his way, perfectly, even when it came to the demo cuts. Years later, Verlaine reflected on the failed collaboration, saying, Eno didn't really understand our music. He was trying to make it something it wasn't, and it just didn't work. The whole thing sounded like The Ventures. It sounded so bad. I kept saying, why does it sound so bad? And Eno would say, what do you mean? It sounds pretty good to me. Conflicting visions between the band and Eno made it impossible for the sessions to move forward. Despite the failure of these sessions, the recording would eventually see the light of day, but not in the way that anyone expected. The demos leaked out, and they were soon circulated in bootleg form. Perhaps the most famous of these is the record you see right here, Television Live with Brian Eno. Of course, this wasn't a live album, and you can see that they even misspelled, likely on purpose, Eno's name as Bryan. This adds a layer of intrigue to the bootleg's mythology. Despite its flaws, these sessions have become an intriguing piece of rock history. It's a window into what might have been. While the performances lack the polish of what would later become Marquee Moon, they still provide an interesting glimpse into the band's early sound. It's worth taking a moment to reflect on where both Eno and Television were in their careers at the time of these sounds. 1974 was a pivotal year for both, and it's easy to see why the stakes felt so high for everyone involved. For Television, the stakes couldn't have been higher. They had started playing gigs at CBGB's by this point, building a reputation as one of the most innovative bands in the scene. But despite their growing popularity, they were still unsigned and hadn't released a full-length album. These sessions with Eno represented a potential breakthrough, a chance to align themselves with one of the most forward-thinking producers in the era, and in doing so, gain wider recognition. Eno, on the other hand, was already on a different trajectory. By late 1974, he was seen as a pioneer in the world of experimental music, had just released 2 of his own solo albums, the second one being Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy. His work as a producer was attracting some pretty big names in rock. Once again, David Bowie would soon enlist him to work on his iconic Berlin trilogy. The albums including Low from 1977, Heroes from 1977, and Lodger from 1979.
Because I'm not quite sure what it is that Brian does. I mean, he doesn't play very much. I always mix my albums. So I guess it has something to do with the fact when he puts himself into a work situation, he just changes the parameters of what you're doing more by verbalizing different approaches to what one does. So it's more kind of a philosophic content with Brian than a kind of a didactic, musicianly kind of overall control.
At the time of the television sessions, Eno was still carving out his reputation as a visionary producer, and he was striving to make a bigger name for himself in that arena. In many ways, the Television Eno collaboration was a reflection of the larger tensions in the music world at the time. Punk versus art rock, rawness versus polish, tradition versus experimentation. Eno wanted to try new things, altering what recorded sound could be, while television was more concerned with capturing the essence of their live energy. Obviously, neither approach was inherently wrong, but the clash between them and the sizable egos involved was too great to overcome. So what became of television after the failed sessions with Eno? In short, they took matters into their own hands. Disillusioned by their experience with Island, the band remained in New York and decided to self-produce their debut album. The result was Marquee Moon, released in 1977, an album that has since been hailed as one of the greatest records of the 1970s and one of the most influential albums in rock history. The album's title track, with its 10-minute-long running time, sprawling guitar solos, and intricate interplay between Verlaine and Lloyd, was unlike anything else at the time. It captured the energy and rawness that Verlaine had been so protective of during the Eno sessions, but it also showcased the band's musicianship and their ability to blend punk's urgency with a more sophisticated, almost jazz-like approach to songwriting. From its earliest moments, Marquee Moon has always been praised for its innovation, and its influence is spread far beyond the punk scene. More than perhaps any other punk band, Marquee Moon helped lay the groundwork for the post-punk movement that would follow, influencing the likes of Joy Division, Talking Heads, Sonic Youth. Television, however, would only release one more album, Adventure, before disbanding in 1978. But their legacy was cemented with that debut. Yeah, I know, there was their reformation in 1992, which resulted in a self-titled release, as well as a handful of other live albums, but whatever. So, what can we learn from this brief, ill-fated collaboration between Television and Eno? Well, even when the best laid plans fall apart, great art can still emerge. The failed sessions might have been a setback for both parties at the time, but in the long run, it didn't last long. It allowed Television to take control of their sound and deliver a masterpiece in Marquee Moon. And as for Brian Eno, well, like Television, he'd go on to help shape the sound of rock music for decades to come. Like, subscribe, hit that little bell. There are new stories every single week right here on my channel. And next week, I'm going to talk about David Bowie's greatest embarrassment. In the meantime, definitely check out that episode covering the fall of the Mercer Arts and the rise of CBGBs. See you next time.